Hello again, this is Mike with Toy Train Tips and Tricks. And one of the more confusing concepts for beginning hobbyists is understanding the differences between O scale and O gauge, and how these differences affect our modeling choices. Adding to this confusion is the fact that many hobbyists and even some manufacturers use these terms interchangeably and incorrectly when they are in fact distinct and separate concepts. In railroad terms, gauge refers to the distance between rails on the track. For example, the standard gauge in North America, not to be confused with Lionel standard gauge toy trains, but for the real trains, North American standard gauge and also in the UK is 4 feet 8.5 inches. That is the distance between the two rails. There are, however, other track gauges in use such as 3-foot gauge, meter gauge, 30-inch gauge, 5-foot gauge, and more. In model railroad terms, O gauge, and while technically it should be 0 gauge, but that's another story. Anyway, O gauge refers to any train running on track that is 1 1/4 inches between the outmost rails. Here we see a collection of model toys and model trains that all use O gauge track, 1 1/4 inches. Obviously these trains differ in size, they differ in detail, they differ in the manner of reflecting reality. Some are meant to be train models and some are just mere toys, but all of them operate on O gauge track, 1 1/4 inches, nevertheless. So as modelers, simply knowing that a train is O gauge is not enough information to determine how effectively it will operate with our other trains in our overall modeling and operating scheme. We don't know how well whether it'll play well with others on our layout. We must also consider whether the model is built to be operated on 3-rail track or 2-rail track. 2-rail locomotives use a different method of electrical pickup than 3-rail locomotives, and so the two are not interchangeable, although some manufacturers have made some that can switch from one to the other. For rolling stock, there's differences in wheel types, wheel contours, wheel flanges, and the couplers that make 2-rail and 3-rail O gauge trains mostly incompatible without some changes. So why do we use 3 rails in the first place? Well, that's a topic for another video. If you look to the top, you can click on that link for why Lionel trains run on 3-rail track. Or you can just accept that we do and move along with this video. So in modeling terms, scale refers to the relative proportion of the model to its real-life counterpart, or prototype, as we say in the modeling universe. HO scale models, for example, are built to a proportion of 1/87th actual size. S scale models are 1/64th actual size. So O scale models are built to a proportion of 1/48th actual size. Or sometimes 1/43rd actual size, but that's another story, especially if you're talking about European prototypes. Another way of thinking about scale is to determine what measurement is equal to a scale foot. This is similar to the scale of a map, in which such measurements 1 inch to the mile or 1 inch to 100 miles. O scale is generally thought of, at least here in the US, as 1/4 inch to the foot. However, we quickly see that by that scale, our 1 1/4 inch track would be 5-foot gauge, not 4 feet 8.5 inches. But frankly, most modelers just ignore this discrepancy in favor of the easy math of 1 inch equals 4 feet. Those who are more comfortable using metric measurements measure out O gauge instead of 1/4 inch to the foot as 7 millimeters to the foot. And so by measuring the gauge in millimeters instead of to the nearest 1/4 inch, you get almost exactly the 4 feet 8.5 inches, but that scales out a little larger at 1/43rd and a half scale. So that's the difference between the 1/48th and the 1/43rd. They're very close together, but if you want to make your trains match, the 1¼ inch gauge, then you want the 1/43 trains. Most of us in the US, we just do the easy math, and 1/4 inch, 1/48 is close enough. O scale is a wonderful proportion to work with in modeling. Details are easy to see, they're simpler to construct, trains are large and easy for kids of all ages to handle, even those kids who wear trifocals. The disadvantage, however, is that trains built to true 1/48 scale require a great deal of real estate to turn around realistically. And since very few of us have room for layouts large enough to accommodate track curves in excess of 12 feet in diameter, manufacturers have devised methods of making these trains capable of navigating tighter curves. One of these methods is to use different scales, but with O-gauge track. Okay, to demonstrate the problem of proportion and scale among O-gauge rolling stock, I have a collection of boxcars that I'm going to compare to this K-Line MP15. Now the MP15 is virtually a 1/48 scale model. It is very, very close to a true scale model. And so we're going to compare some boxcars and see how they compare. Now remember, all of these are O-gauge, but you're going to see they're not necessarily O-scale. So first we have this Lionel 3464 operating boxcar, which this is the same size as the Lionel 6454 series boxcars that were offered in the immediate post-war period, 1945 up into 1953, and actually a little bit beyond that. But this was the basic Lionel boxcar at the time. And while this car had some nice scale details and a somewhat realistic paint scheme, and it looked good with the smaller locomotives like the 671 or 2020 Turbine, same locomotive, different number, things like the K4 Pacific, things like the 221 steamer, and even the FA Alcos that came later, looks great with those. But when Lionel came out with their scale-proportioned NW2 switcher and the classic F3, which are more scale models, these boxcars looked ridiculously small by comparison, and that opened the door for competition. In the early 1950s, a company called Auburn Models, later known as AMT, who was later purchased by Kusan, came out with a line of scale boxcars. These are based on a 40-foot scale, 40-foot boxcar that was common from the late 1930s. You still saw some of them into the 1970s, but this was a common car of the time. And this was a true scale model, and as you see, it compares favorably with the scale size locomotive in front of it. And not so much the Lionel car, which looked ridiculously small by comparison. These Auburn/AMT/Kusan cars are what the Menards cars of today are based on. This is in fact a Menards car based on that old tooling. So Lionel responded with a car that kind of split the difference. It was bigger than the 6454, but not quite as large as the Kusan. The idea being that it would look good with both the scale models and with the smaller, less scale models as well. And this was their 6464 line, which ran through the post-war era, and during MPC times became the 9700, 9800, 9300 series, which this boxcar here is a 9420. This is an MPC car based on those same molds. So as you can see, it proportions better with our scale locomotive than their original 6454. It's longer, it's taller, but still under scale. This is what a lot of collectors call traditional size for O-gauge, because it's not quite 1/48. It's kind of in the middle. And again, it's smaller than the scale Menards car in this case. So that's one thing people complain about with the Menards cars, is that they're bigger than the Lionels. And the reason for that is the Menards is a scale 40-foot boxcar, whereas the Lionel is not quite to scale. Meanwhile, Marx was offering a line of cars that, while they ran on O-gauge trucks, they were actually proportioned to 1/64th or S scale. This model is a K-line model, but is based on the original Marx tooling. And this model is actually a 50-foot boxcar rather than Lionel's 40-foot boxcar. But because it is 1/64th scale instead of 1/48th, it is a much smaller car than the 40-foot model. But it did, while it looks really small with a scale-type locomotive, it looks just right in comparison with one of Marx's undersized steam locomotives, which were, again, roughly based on 1/64th scale instead of 1/48th. And likewise, when Lionel decided to compete with Marx for the low end of the O-gauge market, when they came out with their Scout line, the design for the Scout boxcar is a 50-foot double-door appliance or automotive boxcar, 50 foot, but scaled to 1/64th instead of 1/48th, and that makes it almost identical in size to the Marx product. So 1/64th versus 1/48th, they all run on O-gauge trucks, but they are not O-scale. So then what is O27 scale? Well, O27 really isn't a scale. O27 just means that it is a train capable of navigating the tight O27 curves. Some of these models can be close to 1/48th scale, such as Lionel's NW2s, F3s, RS3s, GP7s. These models are all pretty close to scale, but they will accommodate O27 curves. On the other hand, some locomotives have to be shortened. We use the term selective compression to make them other scales in order to fit on O27 curves, such as the 686 Turbine, the 2055 Hudson, and others. A true O-scale 686 Turbine would not fit on an O27 curve. Likewise, large steamers like 4884 Big Boys and super large diesels like DD35s have been offered in less than scale versions in order to accommodate O27 curves. And that leads me to this bonus trick. How do you disguise the fact that you have different sized cars in the same train? So here I have both the scale Menards car and the not quite scale Lionel car in the same train, only a couple cars apart, and my locomotive is a scale MP15, but my caboose is a very much undersized Southern Pacific type. Well, a trick that I use is break up the different size boxcars with non-like types of cars, in this case a tank car or the operating log car, and so by not having them right next to each other as the train goes by, when it's in motion especially, it makes it very difficult to tell that they are of different proportions. If I had these two coupled one next to the other, the difference would stand out like a sore thumb. And here you see what I mean. When they are coupled next to one another, it's very obvious the difference in height and length between the two cars. But by putting a tank car in between, it helps to disguise that fact to the eye. So again, that's how I mix cars of different scales within the same train. So which should you choose? Scale or O27 or something in between? Well, it depends on your tastes and on your needs. I chose O27 track because it's less expensive, it's readily available, and the lower track profile looks more realistic to me. On the other hand, standard O track is more durable. It mates with most other brands of modern track systems, and flexible tracks such as Gargraves and Atlas O, and it can accommodate larger models that are closer to scale. So a lot of this has to do with how much space do you have and how realistic do you want your layout to be. Ultimately, your choice comes down to your personality and your desires for your layout. So whichever you've chosen, until next time, please like the video, subscribe, share, tell your friends, tell your neighbors, and most certainly, keep those trains running.